Coming up on Headline Humboldt, North Coast Congressman Jared Huffman touts the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, a bill that he says helps to underline the enormous success Democrats have had this year legislatively. Also, KEET contributor Eric Black reports on the Arcata Gateway project and difficulties faced in planning for the future. Coming up now on Headline Humboldt. This is Headline Humboldt. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. We sat down earlier this week with North Coast Congressman Jared Huffman to talk about the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and how that legislation goes a long way toward making the United States a leader once again in climate action. The November midterms are fast approaching, and the political parties are angling to put their best arguments forward. As Huffman notes, adding passage of the IRA to the already existing list of Democratic accomplishments could ultimately help Democrats break the historic trend of midterm collapse for the party in power.
First, to the process, you're absolutely right, James, that this Congress probably doesn't win any style points for the way we have delivered, but we have delivered, in many cases, really big and historic and transformative things. This is a great example. Last November, I and my colleagues in the House worked to pass this really great and ambitious bill called the Build Back Better Act, and the climate provisions of that had been very thoroughly vetted with Senator Manchin and others in the Senate. So we felt that it was pretty ready to go. And unfortunately, Senator Manchin has been really hard to work with. He doesn't keep his promises. He's really sketchy on many of these climate things anyway, given his family business in the coal industry. And so, you know the way it played out. He pulled the rug out from under the whole deal. We spent many months basically courting his support, only to have him a few months ago say, it's over, I'm not going to do anything on climate. And that was pretty discouraging. So we turned up the heat, and a lot of people turned up the heat, including, people like Bill Gates that went and lobbied Manchin. And what we got included many of the provisions that we had worked on in the House, but not all. And it also included some things that I'm not thrilled about that Manchin insisted that we put in there. But on balance, it is the biggest by far investment we've ever made in this clean energy transition. And it's going to be great for everything from offshore wind to energy efficiency and other renewables, and also good for us at the consumer level, those of us that want to decarbonize our lives by electrifying our homes, by making them more energy efficient, by buying electric vehicles. This bill includes really powerful new incentives and tax credits to help every one of us be able to do that in the years ahead.
Now, you mentioned that there are some pieces of it that, aren't exactly what you would want. I mean, can you describe a little bit about what that is without getting too far in the weeds?
Yeah, Manchin created this hostage situation where if you want to do offshore wind, if you want to do renewables on our public lands, you have to offer these really large fossil fuel lease sales every single year. It's a terrible policy, and it's not something that I would ever support. But the good news there is that there's several ways to work around that and to prevent it from being this huge rush to more fossil fuel development. And in the case of Humboldt's offshore wind lease, there may even be an opportunity for the Department of Interior to push that lease out before the Manchin bill provisions take effect. If we can do it by the end of this year, that would mean you don't have to offer these fossil fuel leases. But I'm also going to be working with the administration to make sure that while they might technically comply with these fossil fuel lease offerings, they can do it in a way that doesn't actually lead to oil and gas production. Okay. That is my goal, because we've got to start leaving those fossil fuel reserves in the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. You've been, like I said, been vocal on this issue for years. You've even traveled internationally to attend, events where this has been the centerpiece. How do you think that this will affect the United States' ability to push other countries to take action on climate? Does this give us more moral authority, so to speak?
Yeah, it puts us in the game. And, when I was in Glasgow for the last climate conference, we were assuring the world that we were back. The Biden administration had done some really positive executive orders and sent important policy signals. We had passed the Build Back Better Act out of the House. And we were asking the rest of the world to just trust that the United States was going to do our part and step into a leadership role. When Manchin just kind of killed it all a few months ago, I was very worried that folks that were part of our delegation to the Cairo Climate Summit this fall were going to have to wear paper bags over our head. I mean, I thought we were going to have nothing to show, and our credibility would be trashed. And, poor Secretary John Kerry, who was our special envoy, has been running around the world asking people to believe in U.S. leadership, and it was going to be a very tough sell for him, too. So this legislation absolutely puts us back in a leadership role globally. And, there's all sorts of interesting fault lines right now on the world stage. You've seen that, China is so furious with us over Taiwan that they've announced that they're suspending cooperation with the United States on climate. I think that's bluster. I think the rest of the world is with us on this, and China absolutely cannot afford to, go it alone on some fossil fuel paradigm while the rest of the world moves towards a clean energy economy. They have to try to compete with us. And I actually believe that rivalry and even some of the friction that is feeding into it right now can be kind of productive on this climate issue. It can lead to a righteous competition between us and China to see who can do it the best and the most.
Yeah, sort of the classic Cold War scenario, but hopefully in this, we got space, we got the visits to the moon. Maybe this will help us get our climate moonshot kind of thing.
Absolutely. Let the climate Cold War begin.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I've noticed with the climate thing, and I actually saw a poll recently that shows that more Americans actually support efforts on climate change than we've been kind of led to believe. There's been this idea that it's evenly split between climate, deniers and climate, the sky is falling kind of folks. Well, that's not true, actually. Most people understand that the climate is going through some pretty dramatic changes and that most of it's human caused. My question is, how do we convert that knowledge into a demand for action? It seems like with all the other issues that are going on in this country, the people aren't en masse demanding action, and that might be necessary to get a lot of these governments off the the starting line. How do we make it more salient for everyday people and make them demand action?
Well, I think the planet is making that case for urgency virtually every day, right? I mean, we've had just in this country in the last several months, we've had, I think, 5,000-year floods. We know all about wildfires. Thankfully, the Six Rivers fire is coming under control and hasn't been the disaster that we feared it might be. But it's constant. And I think that is contributing to, not just the growing climate awareness that you referred to, but a sense of urgency and frankly, a feeling among most Americans that we are going to have to demand action, that we're going to have to call out inaction. And the other piece of this, James, that I feel very strongly about is we don't have time for fake climate solutions. And so when you see the fossil fuel industry and others talking about, these industry favorites like carbon capture and storage, these are absolute charades. These are ways that the fossil fuel industry can delay real transformational climate action. And it's a huge waste of our tax dollars and our time. So I spend a lot of my time just kind of calling BS on fake climate solutions offered up by the fossil fuel energy and in some cases by my Republican colleagues.
Yeah, clean coal. Someone upstairs whispered to me is a prime example of that.
Well, and natural gas, is a big one. When you dig a little deeper, the few Republicans that will talk about climate change and say that it's real and say they want to do something about it, when you dig deeper into what their agenda is, it's just pushing natural gas, and that's not a climate solution. That's going to take us backward.
Yeah, it's still the same route. source. So now there are a lot of other aspects of this legislation, obviously, and a lot of it's paid for through tax reform. It does, however, leave a lot of Trump's tax cuts in place, but there's a lot of other, maneuvering around the edges to get this thing funded. Do you feel like that's unfinished business as far as you're concerned? Is that something you might look to address in the future, or is it okay where it is?
Well, it's not okay. We gave a huge windfall to corporations and to the wealthiest billionaires on the planet with that 2017 tax giveaway. So when we can get the political capacity in the Congress to change those things, I will support that, and I hope we can do it. But this is progress, what we see in the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, the fact that we will finally have a minimum corporate tax when you have all of these multi-billion-dollar corporate profit statements where they end up paying zero federal income tax.
And they're bringing home record profits a lot of the time. I mean, it's like
it's insane. So, requiring at least a minimum 15% tax. We're going to have to look at this global minimum corporate tax as well. That's a piece of it, but also this tax on corporate stock buybacks. That's a good idea. These are kind of base hits. They're not home runs on tax reform, but I think they're meaningful and they will help.
Absolutely. The other one thing I saw mentioned in one of the write-ups was that it invests in Western drought resiliency. Obviously, that's something that we're dealing with out here, not so much in Humboldt County, but in the West. The drought situation is dire. Can you describe for us a little bit about what that means exactly and how that might shape up?
Yeah, in this particular bill, the roughly $4 billion in drought provisions are meant largely to address the critical drought situation in the Colorado River Basin. This is something that Senator Kyrsten Sinema insisted on as part of her support for the package. My team and I were involved in reviewing and making sure that these provisions were beneficial and weren't some stalking horse for bad water projects. And we're comfortable that they are going to bring relief to areas that desperately need them. California will get a little bit of benefit, but it's mostly the Colorado River Basin, parts of our state, and Arizona and other Colorado River states. It is bad. I don't need to tell you in the Colorado River Basin. It's terrible in the Klamath Basin as well, and in many parts of California. But Congress already put record historic amounts of money on the table through a previous bill called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Absolutely.
And I played a leading role in writing the water and drought resilience provisions of that. We are making available historic levels of money for drought resiliency, and it's going to be pushing out the door in the weeks and months ahead and making a difference.
One of the challenges of all this is that with the ongoing climate situation, it's hard to predict where the climate's going to go or end up in any given year or even over a set of years. So, I mean, it makes it really hard to, prepare the country to handle things when you don't know what the patterns are ultimately going to be. But
it does. But to me, that underscores the importance of smart investments, and that's what we put into the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I mean, I've been around water long enough to know that many people traditionally have defined California water as a fight over a few large controversial dams that at the end, if you ever find the money to build them, will only benefit, a few powerful special interests, usually in the San Joaquin Valley or Los Angeles, right? We got to do a lot better than that. We've got to make sure that the limited dollars that we have are going to things that produce wet water for as many communities as possible, and that they are resilient water strategies. And so that's why, you see us pushing things like really large-scale water recycling. There's so much untapped potential for large-scale water recycling, advanced water treatment and groundwater management and storage, stormwater capture, obviously water use efficiency and conservation, desalination. These are the tools that are going to actually make us resilient in the face of all the climate curveballs that we know are coming our way.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the more popular measures in the bill that I've seen is the allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Can you talk a little bit about that benefit? And then also, do you think that that'll have any impact on people who aren't on Medicare, who need a monthly medication but still aren't old enough?
Yes, and the answer is yes to that. There's also a cap on insulin costs for seniors. I wish that we'd been able to extend that cap to everyone, even if they haven't aged into the Medicare program. But for some reason, Republicans want the rest of us to pay sky-high insulin costs. It's just indefensible, and so they had an amendment to the bill that got enough votes to
and that was
stop us.
a pointed move they made. It wasn't like some byproduct. They accomplished that.
It was just
their goal.
Naked shilling for pharma, and that's sort of what they care about. But look, for the rest of us, it's a big deal that after many years of not letting Medicare even negotiate with pharma for drug costs, we now will have them negotiating. That's going to just save trillions of dollars over time. And the benefits of that will redound beyond just the Medicare system, because the Medicare prices typically are the benchmarks that other health plans and providers use to set what they will pay for drugs. So those savings are going to go throughout the healthcare system, and it's going to be very meaningful. Just
to reassure people, that's not going to crash the pharmaceutical industry, right? I mean, there's not going to be suddenly a bunch of homeless drug company employees.
Yeah, no, don't shed any tears for big pharma. They're doing just fine. And the fact that, like every other country in the world, we will now be negotiating with them for our drug prices. They managed to keep the lights on all over the rest of the world. I think we can do that here in the United States.
Absolutely. Now, so on the politics of all this, briefly, this bill follows a bunch of other legislation, like you mentioned, the infrastructure bill, and it's not the Build Back Better package. It was winnowed down, and you mentioned the intricacies with Manchin and Sinema and, as part of the reasoning for that. But how do you think this helps the Democrats moving forward into this midterm election? Is it what you hoped you'd have in terms of momentum? How is that working out, do you think?
It is. And at the beginning of our discussion, James, I said we probably don't get any style points for how we got here. But the truth is, Democrats are on one heck of a roll. If you look at everything from the American Rescue Plan that rolled out the most successful vaccine deployment program in history, that helped get the pandemic under control, get kids back in school. They got emergency relief to families and small businesses during the worst days of the pandemic so that we wouldn't crash into a depression, lifted the economy out of a ditch. I mean, it's been enormously successful. Then you move to these historic infrastructure provisions. I mean, we haven't been able to do something big and bold on infrastructure in decades, and we got it done. Without Republican support, unfortunately. There were a few Republicans that joined us, folks like my late colleague Don Young from Alaska, but most of them wouldn't even support infrastructure. It had become too radicalized for MAGA Republicans. And now we move on to finally making a down payment on the kind of bold climate action we need, giving Medicare the ability to negotiate lower drug prices, fixing some provisions that will help keep Affordable Care Act premiums low. They were set to go up dramatically. So we're making a big difference. We passed another bill called the CHIPS Plus Act that is aimed at reclaiming our global leadership role on science and domestic semiconductor manufacturing and things that will fix this supply chain crisis that has prevented us from having new cars and showrooms, among other things. So it's just a remarkable series of achievements, helping veterans, finally getting veterans the care and support they need when they've been exposed to these toxic burn pits and have horrible diseases years after their service. It's a good story to tell, and I think what you see in a growing number of elections around the country is that Democrats are rebounding. The Supreme Court is helping us, James, with these crazy radical decisions they've been issuing on choice and religious liberty and so many other things. I mean, people are realizing this Republican agenda is radical and dangerous. These folks are unfit to govern, and that's why Democrats are going to win elections this fall.
The city of Rio Dell celebrated the finishing touches of its new mural by artist Julia Fordyce. The mural, Our Town, features the faces of family and friends of those living and past. Jim Brickley, the vice president of the Rio Dell Scotia Chamber of Commerce, says they plan to add more murals throughout the city, including the police station and post office.
This has been a project that's been about 3 years in the making, and the original intent was a history of Rio Dell, Scotia, the Eagle River Valley, but as we started getting the faces up, it kind of morphed into a community type composition.
This design for this piece grew really organically through the amount of people that we're, deciding on what we're painting in this town. It grew through the subject matter itself. So we called for faces of loved ones living or past to represent just a cross section of this beautiful community and how it's changed. And as we worked on it, it doubled in size from the initial 50 faces to 101 by the time we're finished with the front. And so yeah, it's basically just been a way to tell stories, people's careers, love stories, family, and histories.
The mural was established as part of a beautification project for the city. Julia offered to go ahead and paint the mural. Jim Brickley and Julia, between them, decided that it would be a good idea to represent the community with ancestors and contemporary people's faces painted on the mural. The diversity of people and the depth of time that these people represent truly represents our town in Rio Dell.
There's a beautiful mural, and I'm proud to have my face on it. I hope everybody comes and sees it. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Across the street is also a mural just completed by Blake Reagan, a name you might recognize from KEET's Studio Space series. Suzanne Mace explains how the mural on her building is in honor of the wildlife she helps protect through her cannabis advising company.
We actually arrived in Humboldt because of the legislation that passed in 2015 to legalize cannabis. So we came here to help farmers actually go through that legalization process and become compliant farms in a very highly regulated system. Part of that process happened with us discovering the yellow-legged frog, the northern spotted owl, and the marbled murrelets. So we're very fortunate through this process to have gotten to know these protected animals, and we're doing our share to try and keep them here on the planet for all of us to enjoy. In the meantime, come to Rio Dell and take a look.
Arcata is wrestling with a chicken or egg dilemma. To accommodate population growth, city officials are asking the public what size apartment buildings the city should permit. Staff will then study how city infrastructure could accommodate the public's aspirations. But as Headline Humboldt's Eric Black reports, critics say they first need the infrastructure analysis before they can articulate a vision for building heights.
The majority of our constituents are terrified that this project is going to ruin the city that they love so much.
The project, or more accurately, the Gateway Plan, would rezone 138 downtown acres west of the plaza. Private developers could then build up to 5 stories here at 10th and O, 7 stories on M north of 12th, and up to 8 stories just south of the Creamery building in the so-called Barrel District.
Is it a safe location to build? As far as the grand jury report on the sea rises, it specifically said that the bay is sinking, and it also had a particular issue with large buildings being built on wetland areas, which the Barrel District is a formal wetland area.
Going to 8 stories high, we're not equipped to handle it. The fire department will be put in potential crisis and jeopardy for being able to serve the emergency needs. It seems incomprehensible to me that a recommendation on building height could come out of the Planning Commission or the City Council until we have a full economic analysis of what it's going to cost the City of Arcata citizens and the fire district to actually provide the protection there.
We have had those discussions with Arcata Fire staff since the very beginning. We are just now getting into the development of the EIR and are starting to work through the special studies that are needed to evaluate those environmental effects. There may be a point when those buildings are feasible, cost feasible, and they're being built, and it's also cost feasible and reasonable to have a mitigation measure that says when you build a building over X stories tall, you have to contribute to a fund. And that fund then goes towards, purchasing new equipment for services that can't currently be provided.
It takes a very long time for development. And if you don't get anything in place, then you're not going to be able to even start to find out who can do what or when or how many years it's going to take. I mean, a lot of people wanting to have all the soils figured out before you do it. You can't do that. Every soil is different. And when you go to start building or thinking about it, that's when you're going to start your process. Change is one of the hardest things we can possibly have in our life. But if we're going to continue to be a community that people like, we're going to have to change.
On August 23rd, for the first time, the ultimate decision makers revealed how much change they envision. Assuming stepbacks on the top stories, 6 of 10 city council members and planning commissioners supported 8-story buildings south of the Creamery. Elsewhere, at least half of the decision makers supported building to that district's proposed maximum of 5, 6, or 7 stories. 3 decision makers supported maintaining the current 4-story cap throughout the gateway. Proponents say high-rises will alleviate Arcata's housing shortage, save space for parks, and by concentrating the population downtown, will empower residents to walk, bike, and take the bus. They note in exchange for being allowed to build high-rises, the plan would require developers to offer community amenities like potentially wider sidewalks, bike storage, and playgrounds. Critics say high-rise gentrification will exile current gateway tenants to the city's outskirts, and that population growth could overrun the city's wastewater treatment system. They say large buildings shade solar panels, create dark and damp wind tunnels for pedestrians, spoil sightlines, and cramp parking. Critics demand lower building heights when the updated gateway plan is released next month.
And hopefully that disillusioned person will be able to say again, this is the Arcata I know and love. Thank you.
Eric Black.
That's it for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to Eric for his great reporting. And also thanks to David Thompson, our producer here at KEET. He put together that VOSAT on the Rio Dell mural, which is fascinating. I want to remind people that we have a couple of podcasts that they can check out on any of the major podcast platforms, Crossing the Bar and What's Wrong with Humboldt and How Can We Fix It. Please wrap it up and check it out. So stay tuned, stay informed.
Now Hear This takes you to locations like you've never seen before and brings you great music from our most celebrated composers.
To Vivaldi.
Cheers. It's a chance to see and hear a lot of new and amazing things. PBS is the perfect home for this. There's no other network in the United States that does this kind of content. Programs like Now Hear This could not happen without your support. I'm a member of my local PBS station, and I hope that you will become one too. Thank you.